Hello everyone, my colleague Cyril Polycarp and myself, we present to you our communication entitled The Goodwill Games, a tool of sports diplomacy to renew the US-Soviet dialogue between 1980 and 1991. This communication is still at an exploratory stage because we have to face two major problems. The first one, the arbitrary classification of the IOC, who placed the Goodwill Games in the Affinity Games and not in the games complementary to the Olympic Games. As a result, this choice will require further reflection. Secondly, the mass of archives in our possession, despite the embargo covering the organization phase of the Goodwill Games in Seattle in 1990. However, we are in possession of archive exchanges for Moscow 1986 and the preparation of Seattle in 1990 up to 1989, as well as numerous press cuttings between 1985 and 1989. Our study aims to understand how to detect and understand political facts through the rivalries of power and territory that they imply. Who are the actors involved in these rivalries, whatever their nature, their function, and their scale of action? In what way are these games of actors the products of diplomatic, sporting, and territorial relations? And how do they produce them? What are the various sporting and territorial representations at stake, and in what way can they be factors of conflict and diplomatic rivalry or vectors of social peace, a pacifying element? A cultural history of international relations, as Robert Frank author, with multiple entries. The first one, the Goodwill Games, as a model for the renewal of geopolitical reading grids after the boycotts of 1980 and 1984. Secondly, the Goodwill Games, the reasons for success, resituating these games as a model of mini-Olympic Games. And thirdly, limits and dangers of monocausal vision of the Cold War world. Analysis of the work and historical interpretation of the Goodwill Games. Our part 1 is talking about the Goodwill Games as a renewal of the geopolitical interpretation of the Olympic idea after the 1980 and 1984 boycotts. The first image is a capture of the press conference of 20 February 1980, improvised by the President of the United States of America, Jimmy Carter. Indeed, Jimmy Carter overturned all the geopolitical models of the time by making a political decision without consulting the national sports authorities and the Olympic authorities. Following the invasion of Afghanistan by the USSR on 24 December 1979, in support of the local government, Jimmy Carter announced the absence of American athletes from the 1980 Moscow Olympics. In the run-up to the US presidential elections in November 1980, Jimmy Carter faced criticisms for his handling of the hostages in the US Embassy in Iran on 4 November 1979 by his opponent Ronald Reagan. Jimmy Carter put an end to the IOC model built up since 1952, when the USSR first participated in the Olympic Games, to the East-West opposition of the world, and to the ideological opposition between the Communist bloc and the Liberal bloc. This quasi-theatrical staging was the dominant key to explaining the peaceful evolution of international sporting relations, despite the rivalries and conflicts on the planet, African countries against South Africa at the Montreal Olympics in 1976, for example. After the American and Soviet boycotts of Moscow in 1980 and Los Angeles in 1984, Ted Turner during a press conference on the 1st July 1985, took up this theme and proposed an invitational media sports event in which the best sporting nations would compete in the main Olympic sports. Ted Turner, billionaire media owner and founder of CNN, wanted to. His tensions between the capitalist nations of the West, the United States, and the communist nations of the East, Russia and its post-war Eastern Bloc. Renew the post-war relationship between the two superpowers, negotiate trade and sports agreements with the then Soviet Union, taking advantage of Mikhail Gorbachev's rise to power and the implementation of his open-door policy, the Perestroika. In December 1985, he concluded an agreement between his company TBS and Soviet sports and broadcasting organizations to organize his multi-sport event from 5 to 20 July 1986 in Moscow, I quote, in a spirit of friendship and goodwill to advance international cooperation in television. This diplomatic channel represents a special case of using sport as a tool for reconciliation and appeasement to sell the image of sport as a rallying force to, I quote, advance peace, understanding, and friendship between our nations. The list of participating countries at the first Goodwill Games in Moscow from 5 to 20 July 1986 gives a sporting but above all a competitive sense where only the best athletes and countries are present. More than 300 athletes from 79 countries competed and were broadcast on TBS. 5 other games were organized in the following years, the last one being held in Brisbane, Australia in 2001. Thus, a new analysis of international sports relations is required. For Pigman and Murray in 2014, sport becomes a diplomatic tool and support for peace, cohesion and conflict management in favor of a cultural policy called sports diplomacy. They continue the work of Lee and Griggs in 2013, who analyzed cultural events as an extension of liberal democracy. With the USSR in the grip of internal and economic difficulties in the face of economically recovering United States in 1985 and 1986, the Goodwill Games can be interpreted as an ideological propaganda tool for capitalism. Indeed, the press clipping of 19 September 1985 supports this idea. The Goodwill Games fulfilled the expectations of American and Soviet athletes to compete in a major international summer multi-sport event for the first time in over a decade. Carl Lewis claimed individual sporting dominance as a criterion of power to the detriment of the collective patriotic interest. The media thus serves the ideology of individualism and professionalism. Now, our second part is about the reasons for the success of the Goodwill Games, resituating these games as a model of mini-Olympic Games. The cultural prism invoked by Ted Turner seems to offer a relevant key to understanding these different areas of conflict. The Goodwill Games seem to reinforce the symbolism that enshrines sport as a peaceful myth. The boycotts of the 1980 Moscow and 1984 Los Angeles Olympics were too quickly labeled as a result of an essentialist conflict between a communist bloc and a Western bloc. This view was partly echoed in the foreign policy discourses of the US neoconservative governments under the Carter and then Reagan presidencies, as well as in the statements of the Western and communist media. The use of sport as a tool to support development, peace, cohesion, and conflict management has been widely accepted and indoctrinated into government policy. But what is new is the indoctrination of sport by the mass media for the benefit of one ideology, liberal and capitalist democracy. Also, the Goodwill Games were not a financial success, losing $25 million in Moscow 1986. For Ted Turner, the Goodwill Games, I quote, improved relations between Americans and Soviets by providing that these countries could put politics aside and come together around a common love of sport. And thirdly, we are looking on the limits and dangers of a monocausal view of the Cold War world, analysis of the work and historical interpretation of the Goodwill Games. The United States Olympic Committee's initiative not to sanction athletes traveling to Moscow 1986 for the Goodwill Games invites us to take a critical view for several reasons. Cultural differences are not described as historical processes, but as atemporal realities existing from eternity. The international relations approach to the boycott can therefore be described as naturalistic, with ideological geographical focus on cultural blocks, but which do not reflect historical temporality that of the arrival of sponsors on the media, while the IOC is organizing itself through the development of its sponsorship program called the TOP program in 1985. Prelude to the TOP program of the IOC and Juan Antonio Samaranch in 1985, Samaranch and Horst Dassler, founder of the Arena Sports brand and son of the founder of Adidas, initiated the document that gave birth to the TOP program, the Olympic Partners, designed to bring together the main sponsors of the Games. 9 commercial partners participated in the program, which generated $96 million over the period 1985-1988. The study found that the use of sports diplomacy has helped to strengthen the country's image, improve relations with other regional nations, and enhance the country's prosperity. The study found that the lack of clear leadership from the Olympic movement and the lack of appropriate strategies did not support the development of sports diplomacy within the IOC. The study also revealed that the lack of adequate financial resources has had a significant impact on the use of IOC sports diplomacy, leaving the field open for powerful countries to take over this mission and engage in a new ideological propaganda flood based on the advent of liberal democracy. At the end, the Goodwill Games have now lost their original justification because Olympism is once again universal and these intermediary sporting events were a form of dialogue between nations that ignored each other and allowed the IOC to regenerate itself as a security support device in the development of peaceful coexistence and the construction of a world space offered by the sponsors in their financial independence. But its sports only vocation to strive to civilize the world space, that is to systematically limit the understanding of political phenomena and actors to a civilizational reading by caricaturing or distorting the complexity of situations. We thank you for your attention and are now open to your questions.